All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Workforce Wednesdays. We are so excited to be with you again this month. You are joining us for today's Building Inclusion, Preparing for and Retaining a Diverse Workforce. If you wouldn't mind putting in the chat your name, a company that you are joining us from, and where you are joining us from in the state of Minnesota. It's really fun to see who's online with us today. Just wanted to let you know that after our formal presentation today, you can stay on for an additional 30 minutes for Workforce Wednesday Unplugged, an informal discussion and Q&A where you can unmute yourself, where you can turn your camera on and ask questions directly to the workforce strategy consultants and to today's panelists. So we are really excited that we will be recording today's event, and we will also be live streaming it, and it will be available afterwards on YouTube. My name is Jackie Buck, and I am the Director of Workforce Strategy at the Department of Employment and Economic Development. Workforce Wednesdays are a networking and educational series on sharing best practices and workforce strategies, and hosted by Dee's Workforce Strategy Consultant team. Next slide. Workforce Wednesdays are held the first Wednesday of every month from 11 a.m. to 12 noon, and these virtual events are focused on highlighting proven strategies to build talent pipelines, to hear and share best practices from our employers, and to network with other employers around all things workforce. So I would ask that as you have questions throughout today's presentation, to please take the opportunity to put them in the chat. And we have a couple individuals who will be monitoring that so that we will work during this presentation to get your questions answered. We have 5 workforce strategy consultants located throughout the state. In Northeast region, we have Chet Bodine, who will be our facilitator today. In the Northeast, Sean Herhusky. In Central, Della Ludwig. In the metro area, Adeshewa Adesiji. And in the Southern region, we have Jessica Miller. They work regionally with employers throughout the state in key industry sectors and in high growth occupations. And we are so excited that they are joining us today to be able to share some of their insights throughout today, as well as the 3 employers who will be our guest speakers today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chet Bodine and have him get us started with this great Workforce Wednesday event.
Excellent. Thank you, Jackie. And thank you to all of the participants here today joining us. It's really great to have the opportunity to share some of our work with you and engage, with different challenges in the state. We know this is a unique time for Minnesota, and we're here to work with you through it. Today, if you want to hit the next slide, please. Here you go. Today's agenda, we're going to talk first about some of those workforce development challenges, what we're hearing from job seekers, what kind of barriers they're facing depending on their circumstances or their background. We'll also talk about, what those job seekers are looking for in a competitive market, and what employers, therefore can do to attract a broader talent pool and develop an important, successful culture in their place of business. Then we're going to hear from some of our employers today. We have 3 employers joining us to talk about the practices that they've developed in their place of business. Each has charted their own path, and they're here to share their story. 2 of our 3 employers are working on the Inclusive Workforce Employer Designation, and that's a recognition program that's being implemented by workforce boards across the state. Finally, I'll wrap up by talking a little bit more about that designation and how it works. And like Jackie said, don't forget to stick around after the event for the unplugged discussion with our employers. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, job seekers today still have a lot of barriers to employment. Of course, COVID was a big one, but even though that overshadowed a lot of them, there are several still out there, and it's important for employers to understand understand this. So as they're going out to recruit and retain employees, they can help them address some of these barriers. Just a few on the list. Criminal history. We worked hard to help those with a criminal history get back into the workforce, be productive citizens. Language barriers for immigrants and others. Health, sometimes, during COVID, that was a big issue. And then other, less apparent things like workplace bias, communities that are less welcoming than they could be, etc. Next slide, please. So given these barriers, there's a lot of things that employers can do to help job seekers succeed. Today, we're going to focus on how to build inclusion in order to prepare for a more diverse workforce and retain a more diverse workforce. Other things, we've heard from job seekers is that, they're looking for a place with strong teams that have flexibility in the schedules, family-friendly work-life balance. And we'll talk about those more over the course of our Workforce Wednesday series. But today, we're going to focus on inclusion in the workplace. Next slide, please. So to start, we're going to try to ask a question because a lot of what was driving kind of a build for more inclusive workplaces is that our labor force in Minnesota has become more diverse over the last 20 years. So just a quick guess for those in the audience, what was the percent of non-white workers in Minnesota's labor force in 2019? Go ahead and throw your answer in the chat. Yeah, we're seeing a lot of different guesses here. I think every answer has probably been guessed at least once. This is great. The answer is D, 17.8% of Minnesota's workforce in 2019. That's according to the American Community Survey. Now, in addition to that, we're going to see changes happen over the course of the next 10 years. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I get into that, I just want to acknowledge that although that's the percentage in the state, that's different in each part of the state. So depending on your region, of course, there's different level of diversity in our labor forces. So this is something we should all be thinking through. What is the level of diversity in my labor force, in my regional labor force? This is really an open-ended question for you to think about as you move forward, because like I said, it changes across the state, but something we should all be paying attention to. Next slide, please. And of course, this is only going to continue over time, the change in our labor force. As you can see, this is projections over the next 10 years. Again, these are the racial categories as defined by the Census Bureau. But we're seeing double-digit gains, continue to see double-digit gains through 2028 in the Black Minnesotan community, in every non-white racial category. It looks like the highest again are Black Minnesotans, Asians, Pacific Islanders will see quite a growth. Next slide, please. We also see changes in the age, the demographics of our labor force. This, of course, is driving part of the labor force shortage that we're seeing right now. We have a huge part of our labor force that's exiting in that 55 to 64-year-old age group. And we don't quite have the numbers entering the workforce at the same time, especially in parts of greater Minnesota. And so we have this real crunch right now. Of course, this is also exacerbated by COVID and other issues. And I'm sure almost all the employers on a call today are feeling this in one shape or form. Next slide, please. Well, without further ado, we want to introduce the employers to you today. We're going to talk a little bit more about the work that they've done to build inclusive cultures. First, I'd like to introduce you to Philomena Saturn from Land O'Lakes. And Philomena has been at Land O'Lakes for a few years now and has, among her numerous accolades and accomplishments, she has been named the AARP Apollon 50 over 50 group, the Minneapolis Business Journal's Woman Change Maker and Minority Advocate, and Minnesota Business Real Power 50 Award. I'll turn it over to Philomena to tell us more about her work at Land O'Lakes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Chad, and thank you, Workforce Development Team. I'm excited to be a part of Workforce Wednesday, my first time. So if you want to advance to the next slide, that would be great. So what I'm going to do is just give you a brief overview of what we've been working on at Land O'Lakes. I joined Land O'Lakes 4 years ago, just celebrated my 4-year anniversary. I say I'm still newer to ag because I worked 29 years in financial services at Wells Fargo. And so I've learned so much. And I am the first full-time person hired at Land O'Lakes to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion. So like many organizations, or for some of you that might be in smaller ones, like how do we get started? What does this look like? And a lot of times it might be a combo role until you feel like, okay, we have the resources. So, all right, so let's move on to the next slide, Sean. Thank you. So one of the things that I worked on when I came to Land O'Lakes is we did not have a statement or a commitment. So if you think about strategy, we wanted to make sure that we had a message to our employees, to prospective employees. This is important as we're doing our work in our community. And so we had a team of people really put together the messaging that you're seeing above. And then there was not a formal strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so one of the things that I've been working on and we have formalized is really developing our strategy into 4 key pillars. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So you think about workforce. So you're all thinking about workforce every day, right? So how do we hire? So when we think about it from that diversity and inclusion lens is how do we recruit? Where do we recruit? Who are those organizations that we work with, our colleges, universities, as we look to hire experienced employees? How do we do that? Another piece is from a training perspective. We have, I think, like about 120 people who work in our talent acquisition area and really working with them on increasing their cultural competency. They look at our applicants, and so trying to reduce bias, look at our job descriptions to make sure that they're inclusive. What are the qualifications? Do people need a college degree or not? And some of those different things. As we look at workplace culture, our tagline is, how does it feel when you work here? So whether you work at our headquarters, you work remotely, you work in the field with our farmer owners, or you work in one of our plants and facilities in the US or abroad, culture is so important. So how do we make sure that we create a culture, no matter where you work in the organization, you're like, I belong here. I feel valued. I feel respected. And I'll share with you a little bit more about some of the learnings, our employee resource groups. Then from a business perspective, there's huge opportunity from a business perspective of how do we integrate diversity, equity, and inclusion into how we do our business. So we started a supplier diversity program and really focused on small businesses that are minority, veteran, LGBTQ. We have a diversity impacts business board made up of employees from our employee resource groups that give feedback to our business and provide cultural insights and market insights. So hopefully we will not have any cultural misses as we go out and try to reach new markets. And community, really important. We know that it's so important to volunteer and be a part of our communities, whether that means giving or doing. So Sean, if you could move to the next slide. In some organizations, and some of yours on the phone, you may have employee resource groups. So they're formed around different dimensions of diversity. We have 11. And so you're going to see some that you're like, I wonder what that is. So Field Inclusion Network, that supports people who work in our plants and facilities. This last year during COVID, we had a new group form, and Chet alluded to that earlier. One of the challenges employees face, or prospective employees, is caregiving. Right? As parents, how do I do this? With the virtual learning at home, with caregiving, with all of the challenges of COVID. So that was formed. And so these 11 employee resource groups support employees. They do career development work. They help us recruit. They help us from a business perspective. And we meet once a month. And then they do a lot of partnering together as well as programming separately. And next slide, Sean. This one I put in because I think this is really helpful from an education perspective, especially if your organization is maybe just stepping in. Like, what does cultural and diversity mean? And so if you look at the I from the beginning, personality. So are you an introvert, an extrovert, an ambivert, where you straddle both? I'm an extrovert, as far on the extrovert scale. So my family during COVID said, Mom, when are you able to return to work? We don't want you checking in and trying to chat with us during the workday. So I was voted off the island. But it's like taking into account the different personalities we work with. Many identify with primary dimensions of diversity, right? So my gender, my age, if I have a disability, whether it's seen or invisible, right? Ethnicity, heritage. My mom is from Ireland. We're Irish on both sides. So that's a really important dimension of diversity for me. Secondary are often the parts where we connect with each other. Oh, you went to school here, or you're from here. And so that helps us connect. Now, if you go to the last ring, and this is often where clashes happen. If I'm a direct communicator and I'm working with Jackie, and let's say she's indirect, she might be like, whoa, Philomena, that's a little bit too much for me, right? Or you think about, are you tasked to relationship? Do you want to get right down to business when you start that meeting? And you're like, why are they wasting time talking about how was your weekend? How are things going, right? And so being aware of some of these important things, how time is measured. In our Irish family, we have all degrees of late. I married into a Norwegian family where they are early for events. What? That never happens in my family. But if those are some of the cultural differences that you need to know to be able to better educate and have those conversations. And these slides will be shared with you afterwards. So if you find this is helpful, feel free to bring that back to your organization. So Sean, next slide. So these are some of the things that we do from a learning. So every quarter we have a learning series it's an hour and a half, different topics, as you can see. Any employee across the organization can participate. We're right now in the process. In August, we'll be hosting our summit, which is hosted by all of our employee resource groups. We're going to have a group called Virtual Broadway. When Broadway closed down, all those actors were displaced. And so they are now doing corporate learning and diversity and inclusion learning. And so it's super exciting. We're going to be doing a really interesting one around generational understanding coming up here in October. Chet talked about this intergenerational workplace. And we're going to have a woman who produced a documentary called A Life Well Lived and interviewed 40 people over 75 years old to find out what are those elements of a life well lived, and have that conversation around how do we appreciate the contributions of all our employees over the spectrum of aging, from starting career to ending career and everything in between. And next slide, Sean, please. One of the pieces that I have learned being in this diversity space for about 23 years now is that it's really important to also provide solutions for employees who work in production environments. And we have over 80 plants and facilities in the US, and they don't have an hour and a half to be able to attend a learning session. So with our plant teams, the supervisors and managers go through the training. It's 15 minutes in length. And then they go through it as learners, and then they become teachers. And then each month they bring back some content to their team and talk about, okay, these dimensions of diversity. How do we create psychological safety? What are these inclusive behaviors? And have these conversations that really help us build those elements of belonging in our plants and facilities. And this has been a really great, I think our plants have really appreciated that. And next slide, Sean. And this is the last slide. So I just want you to think about, as you're entering into this work, the intentionality around, sometimes it's just those little things that we do individually, and sometimes it's the collective, but the power of us really thinking about making a difference in our organizations, families, communities, etc. So thanks, Chet. I know that was fast, but I had a time limit, so I'm going to turn it back to you, Chet, for the next speaker.
Philomena, I really appreciate what you shared here, and talking about being intentional about this stuff at the end there. That's, I think, really important. And well, before we move on, we do have time for a few questions. If we have some questions for Philomena before we, so Della, Jessica, any questions from the audience?
No questions at this time.
We first saw some of Philomena's work at the Forum on Workplace Inclusion when some of our team attended that, and just learned about these great things you're doing. And some of the hardest part of this work is sustaining it over time. And anyway, to learn about the way that they are really sustaining this work, I think is important to know. I did see we had a question come in there, Della.
Yes, we do. It actually is from Cassie, and she's wondering if, Philomena, can you give a better example of like a 15-minute bite-sized learning that you do, and what kind of information that you give?
Yeah. So our supervisors and managers have a workbook. So that has all the content in it. And then each of the employees get a takeaway card for each lesson that happens during the 5 months. So it's a build from the first session is knowing me, knowing you, and talking about in those different dimensions of diversity, to safety is huge in plants. So they talk about physical safety a lot, but how do we create psychological safety? So what happens when you hear something, when someone says something that's non-inclusive? How do we address that? What does that look like? We also talk about bias and some different examples of bias. We have inclusive behaviors, and there's kind of a, how do you value, bridge, and protect? And that's a powerful one. And there's a little inventory that employees go through. And then the last lesson is just kind of a collective of talking through each of the 5 lessons and creating an action plan for employees about what will they do.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question from Patrick was, how are you measuring or tracking the progress?
Well, that's a great question. So we have a lot of different measurements. I used to be all heart in this work. And then back in my Wells Fargo days, I had a manager who's like, we must measure everything. So I've carried that with, so it's a yes and, right? So we look at our representation broadly as an organization in our business lines, promotion, who's in the succession planning queue, so we can take a look at who's ready. We look at turnover. We have an engagement survey. So we, to better understand the day in the life of employees, and we can break that down by demographic. And then each of our training sessions, we look at how many people attended, what the feedback was on a 1 through 5 scale. Supplier diversity, we measure what's our spend, where do we start to what our goal is. So each of the different areas of focus, we have different ways of measuring, but those are some of the things that we do. And then we share that out too with employees so they can better understand what are we doing, why are we doing it, and what are the results.
Wonderful. And another question from Kim is, if your company is scared of starting DEI efforts, what's the to eliminate the intimidation on that? Where do you
Yeah.
start?
That's a really great question. And there is a lot of hesitancy and fear, I think, of getting started. So my motto has always been start small, think big, right? So where do you look at what's happening in your organization? Maybe where are those trouble spots? Is it in recruiting? Is it in retention? Look at your data to maybe help you get started. Make sure that you have a team of people. You may not have a lot in your diversity and inclusion department. There's only 2.3 of us, but we have an exec council of leaders helping. We have, different steering teams. We have our employee resource groups. And so the important part is that you're really integrating it into what you do. I'll also do a little pitch. We have a Twin Cities Diversity and Inclusion Roundtable that's made up of employers really from all over the state. And so if you're just getting started and you're thinking, I would love to be in an organization to learn more and be supported, Chet can feel free to share my contact information. You can email me and say, hey, Philomena, interested in joining that roundtable. The good news is we meet 6 times per year. There's no registration fee to participate. So that's not a barrier for any employer.
Excellent. Philomena, one last question. Any good resources for companies looking to get started at building a solid message and a statement?
Oh, there are so many different, I'll put that in the chat when I get off the hot seat here and just put information on different organizations that do research that might be really good for getting started.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Philomena.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's great. Thank you for sharing those resources. And remember, if you'd like to talk more with Philomena and the other employers, stick around after the event here. We can answer some more of those questions. I saw more questions come through, and I want everyone to be able to engage if they can. Next, we're going to move on and talk to Amanda Nicholson from McNeilus. Amanda's a VP of Human Resources, and in addition to that, she is also oversees environmental health and safety at McNeilus. She's got 20 years of HR experience, and started out right here at the Carlson School of Management, University of Minnesota. So, thanks for coming, Amanda. We're excited to hear about what's going on over at McNeilus.
Sounds good, and it's great to follow Philomena. I definitely learned some interesting things there, and I think, and you can go to the next slide. What I think is kind of cool about how this is getting set up is that was, sort of one view at a bit of a more corporate view, and I'm going to be able to share some maybe strategies that are more at a plant-based view. So I think there'll be some, interesting things, similarities, and then some differences as well. So what is McNeilus? We industry leader in refuse collection vehicles, or what most people call garbage trucks. We are proudly manufactured in Dodge Center, Minnesota. So that's down in southeast Minnesota, not too far from Rochester, about 20 minutes away from Rochester. And we are a part of a much larger parent company called the Oshkosh Corporation, which is headquartered over in Wisconsin. And they make, Oshkosh makes a lot of different kind of heavy equipment. Which is why we're a good complement with our refuse collection vehicles. Next slide. This just gives you a sense of our Dodge Center campus. It's very large. There's a lot of scale. There's a lot of buildings. And to be honest with you, it can be kind of an intimidating place for people to come and work. Maybe help set the stage a little bit for, thinking about how we bring diversity into such a large and kind of complicated place. Next slide. So this just gives some facts about our operation, so you have a little bit of a sense about our scale. So here in Dodge Center, we have about 570 production team members, and we have about 200 office team members. We do have a few other facilities. We have a smaller factory in Riceville, Iowa, a warehouse in Lakeville, Minnesota, and then we have service branches all across the country that are there to help fix and provide service to our different refuse collection vehicles. We were founded over 50 years ago. And also just to give you a sense of what are the kind of people that we're looking for in our factories, it's going to be sort of all of those core heavy manufacturing skills. So welders, painters, material handlers, a lot of machine operators, and then not quite as predominant, but quality technicians and supervisors. So these would be kind of the major skills that we look for when we're out recruiting. Next slide. So I just wanted to start off really kind of deeper diving into our diversity and inclusion efforts by showing our representation. And this is the pie chart that you see on the left is our Dodge Center production workforce. And something that is going to jump out probably to most based on the numbers and the metrics that we were looking at the beginning part of the presentation, looking at representation in the state of Minnesota, you can see that we have a very high level of diversity within our production facility. So we've got about 10% Black or African American, 14% Asian, and over 20% Hispanic or Latino. And really, what that diversity is comprised of, you can see we've got a very high number of immigrants and refugee populations that are here with us in Dodge Center, particularly Vietnamese, Somali, and West Africa. And we do have quite a few team members that are from either Puerto Rico or from Mexico. English as a second language is very common here, and it is something that, you know, we are very supportive of. And I also do want to call out, though, that while we have really great representation in production, one of our biggest areas of opportunity is we need more diversity in our leadership ranks. So that would be something that I would just call out as a major focus area, trying to get people of color in the assistant supervisor and supervisor ranks so that they can grow up the ranks and become leaders within the organization is something that we're very focused on. And while I don't have a chart to represent this from a disability, individuals with disability, we're about 6%. Veterans, we're about 7%. So fairly strong there. We do also have a little bit of an opportunity with females. Within the production space, it's only about 12% of our population are women. So that would be another area of focus for us. So shifting over onto the right side. Oh, sorry, if you don't mind going back. And actually, before I talk a little bit about this, I just want to give a comment on, you know, how did this get to be this way? It is sort of a surprising probably representation. And it really is, you know, we all know there's a lot of labor shortages in Minnesota, and certainly McNeilus has struggled over the years to find the number of people that it needs to support a large operation out in kind of rural southeastern Minnesota. I believe that is part of the reason why the company was always really very open and willing to recruit people of very diverse backgrounds to try to fill those needs. And then what you see is over time, it becomes a place that is friendly to those of all of the different backgrounds. And that's really because some of the best practices that we have. So I think it started out of necessity and need, and then it's really developed into something much bigger than that, and a much more inclusive environment as a result of it. So some of our best practices, I just want to call out. Many of them, we have lots of them, like Philomena talked about, from an Oshkosh Corporation perspective. And, you know, I did a little bit of a blend between Oshkosh as well as McNeilus focused things. You know, right at the top, we have taken the CEO Action Pledge for Racial Equality. So our CEO has signed on to that. That came right after the death of George Floyd. Lots of CEOs came together to make that pledge, and we are a part of that pledge. And so this is just to show that I do believe diversity and inclusion, it starts from a tone at the top, and we have kind of the highest level of commitment in our organizations, racial equality within our corporation as well as in the greater community. We have a very strong company culture of integrity and treating each other with respect. And I believe that is what enabled McNeilus to have such a growth in its diverse populations, that, you know, any type of discrimination or harassment has never been tolerated here, really paving the way for such an inclusive environment. I mentioned this already, English is not required here, somewhat unusual across some of the other manufacturers in our area. And I would say we don't, we're probably not doing as much as we can, but we do a lot to help with interpretation, translations. We've got a lot of interpreters to help us out. And we really try to put as many documents in translation, especially things that are impactful to team members related to their benefits, to their paycheck, you know, anything that's really personal to them, we try to do in the multitude of languages of our team members to give them that sense of belonging and you know, make sure that they understand what we're trying to communicate with them. Word of mouth and employee referrals are the strongest recruitment tactic that we have. And I do think that's a large part, that is largely why we have such great representation, because as we started recruiting more diverse team members, they started telling their family members, their friends, and that has really had just a ripple effect for us to attract and retain our diverse populations. We strongly do believe in partnering when we need help. So I've got a couple of partnership groups that we work with that are Rochester-based, the YMCA. And I saw in the chat somebody gave a description of what that is, the Intercultural Mutual Assistance Association. They're a great organization that they do a lot of the work with the refugees for southeastern Minnesota, but they do cultural and diversity consulting as well. So when we've had challenges in our organization, we've often worked with them to help work with the team members or the cultural group where we were having some challenges with. Diversity Council is also in Rochester, same type of organization with a little bit of a different focus. They've helped us with some training and things like that. And then we are strong believers in the workforce development. So here in Southeast Minnesota, we have Workforce Development, Inc. I'm a member of the board, and we partner very closely with them, with CareerForce, Minnesota Deed. You know, we really look at partnering with all of those different organizations because we do find that that helps our diversity, you know, recruiting as well. Like Philomena discussed, we do have we call them business groups, but the same concept. We have a multitude of those that are mostly driven from Oshkosh. Here in McNeilus, we do have a women's network, a young professional network, and the veteran network, and we're working at launching our multicultural network. And those are great resources for our team members. And then finally, we do strongly believe in the DEI training for leaders. We've done a multitude of different types of DEI training for leaders at all levels of the organization. And actually, I think on the next slide, I detail a little bit more about an upcoming training that we are working on. So you can go to the next slide. I just wanted to highlight a couple of our newer initiatives that we have been working on from a DEI perspective. Chet mentioned this. I'm on the workforce development board, and I've also been a part of a smaller task force on DEI, where we are kind of working on bringing the IWE process to Southeast Minnesota. So I'm really excited to be working on our application for that. More about IWE. We also are really fortunate. We are a dual training pipeline grant recipient. I think I saw Dan Solomon is on here today as well. And it's been great partnering on that. And there's some new DEI training efforts for the dual training pipeline recipients, along with some consulting that we got as a part of that. So we were really excited to be a part of that, collaborate with some other employers, learn some more, and get some more tools and tips from that process. And then finally, we're really excited. We are working on, this is our own internal training effort, partnering with the Strategic Diversity Initiatives consultants. And we're going to bring the power of inclusion to our company, doing a live in-person. We're excited about that because it's kind of the first big thing post-COVID in the second week of September for all of the leaders of the company, as well as any team member who wants to come and take a deeper dive into the power of inclusion. So those would just be a few things that are on the kind of on the docket for us. So with that, Chet, that is the end of my slides.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amanda. It's awesome to hear that you are engaging with other businesses as you learn about this work more, and how you engage with your communities that you know McNeilus operates in to get feedback from the community too. Yep, like she mentioned, we'll talk a little bit more about the IWE at the end here, but and we're gonna again stick around to talk more with Amanda. I saw a lot of questions for her, but I want to give Laura from the YMCA a chance to talk about her work too. So we're gonna segue over to Laura. Laura Marsalik works at the Brainerd Family YMCA as her association. She's the assistant aquatics director and works in fund development there. She's also the acting DEI officer, food program administrator. She's led multiple projects there and has been a good partner in the region for our work. That's the region I work in, and we've done a number of things together. So I'm going to pass it over to her to talk about her work at the Y. Thanks, Laura. How you doing?
Awesome. Doing good. I'm excited to be here. I've got a lot, so I hope I don't go over time. So at the Brainerd Family Y, we've been working on this for, I'm going to say, last year and a half or so. I've been in my current position for about 3 years now. And we just received our IWE, like Amanda was saying. We just received it this year, actually a couple months ago. So really excited about that. And Chet will get more into that. But first off, I want to kind of bring it back to what Philomena was saying on this journey of DEI. So I'm just going to kind of go on this journey with you as I take you with how I started, how I got there, how our Y got there, how our parent organization, YMCA of the USA, got there, and then as a global Y, what that looks like. And if you are unfamiliar with Y associations, we have an umbrella company, YMCA of the USA, which provides charters for all of the associations across the country. But each association has the ability to make up their own business practices. We do have to follow some guidelines and all of that to remain a Y. But in a sense, DEI in general is up to each association to administer and work on in their communities. So with that in mind, We knew we wanted to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And for YMCA, it's called diversity, inclusion, and global because it is a global organization. So we call it DIG. We knew we wanted to work on it. It was something a lot of Ys were doing. We didn't know how to start, but we knew we needed commitment. Our CEO was committed. Our board was committed. But how do we start? So like they said, it needs to start from the top. I need to have assurance that, when we start this work that I have backup. And so we knew that, but we also knew we didn't want to go it alone. And one of our best practices is that we partnered with community organizations that were doing the same work. You can go on to the next slide, please. We partnered with community organizations that were doing the same work so that we could kind of join hands together in our community in challenges, working together through challenges on diversity, equity, inclusion, being an inclusive workforce, but also an inclusive community. So how do we make that work together as all of these pieces come together? And we're stronger when we're together, right? So that was the idea behind that. But before we get into that, my own personal journey with this is initially I thought, okay, I make a plan. I'm going to do this. We're going to through policies. I'm going to change everything. And then when you get to it, all of a sudden, well, if I don't understand it well myself, how are others going to understand? How are we going to then let that trickle down so it's an organization-wide thing? So personally, I needed to do a bunch of training myself and understand where I'm coming from. And YMCA of the USA offers a lot of different trainings and stuff for all staff all over the US for WISE. One of them is Dimensions of Diversity. There's cultural lenses. There's introduction to learning your own biases and so forth. Lots of different trainings. So I studied up. I really kind of let it sink in personally to understand my own perspective and realize that I did have a lot of personal biases I didn't know about. And it helped me to be able to then verbalize. Once I knew the language, I could then verbalize it to others and teach. So it's a journey, right? You need commitment from the higher ups, but it's a journey. You have to start small. It's not going to just happen overnight. It's not going to happen in a year. It's a continual process, and you're going to continue to learn more and more things as you go along. So there's a lot of misconception there, and a lot of misconception that I had when I started. Then, if your CEO or leaders are feeling a little like, our community, I just don't know if they can handle it. I'm worried about the backlash. I don't know how this is going to look for our organization. Building those bridges between other companies and other organizations really lets one individual organization stand a lot stronger when they're making this commitment. So we did that. We partnered with the college. We partnered with other folks, which opened up all kinds of doors for us. And part of that was working with Chet, working on this inclusive workforce designation, but also discovering, or not discovering, but starting the QUIC, or Council Workforce or Community Workforce Inclusion Council. And that has just been tremendous for me personally. I'm going to backtrack. So there, it starts with commitment. It starts with understanding yourself, assessing where your organization is, then providing that education, what's lacking here, and how can I continually support this over time. Next slide, please. Okay. I love that Philomena had a very similar wheel. Well, it's not a wheel. She didn't have a wheel, but it was very similar to this. So YMCA of the USA uses this diverse dimensions of diversity wheel. And right in the middle is the individual. And just like she kind of had, you have those core dimensions of what makes you like things you can't change, right? Things that are solid and set. You have those core dimensions, and then you have those secondary dimensions. Like, for example, being a parent. How does that make me? What does my perspective change when I'm a parent? When someone's talking to me, when I'm interacting with others out in the community, working on programs, you name it. If someone mentioned, or if I'm coming across someone who, you know, um, doesn't quite understand that, where I'm coming from, because they haven't had that experience, what are those pieces that I can connect with others on? Other parents understand it, and vice versa. But so what are those secondary dimensions? And then overall, what are those organizational dimensions as a whole? And I'll have a worksheet on this that you can take with you. It goes over kind of all the different pieces. It's a really nice tool. But yes, so this really helped me understand. And I can give you another example. Age, right? Age is something you can't really change, but it can also be a way to perceive what you're being told or how someone's talking to you. I know that me personally, age is something that I keep in mind when in conversations. If I'm talking to someone and they think I'm younger than I am, sometimes it can be frustrating and that kind of thing. So age is something that I keep in mind when I'm in conversation with others, just as an example. Okay, so going from here, I'm going to get into a little bit about, and as a why, like our why in particular, our CEO made a statement. We sent it out to all of our staff. And so, a little bit about our why. We have about 85 employees. It's a very small organization, and not a lot of diversity. So probably about 1% to 2%, and then the rest are white. So not a lot, but still, this is growing in our community, and it's becoming more and more of a topic of discussion for employers across our area. So our CEO made a commitment. We sent it out. We did a public statement. And then our parent organization, because we have to follow certain standards, we have to send them some information every year or annually we're doing. And part of that is diversity, equity, and inclusion questions about what we're doing. And so every year we're able to do a survey of where we're at, and they give us information on where we can improve. So we have this assessment process already in line for us, which is really nice. Otherwise, there are some other assessment tools online. But so we knew that going in. We have these trainings for employees. YMCA of the USA also provides some other things for us. So ERGs, they do provide that. We have kind of like a network that people can go online. They can see other YMCAs, other postings. They can connect with other ERGs that can help them in their career in the Y. So let's say as a woman, I can go to the ERG for women only, and I can pair with someone who is in a higher position in their Y or organization to be as a mentor for me as I continue down my pathway. So that is an opportunity that they provide, and they provide that with every single ERG, which is really, really nice. Okay, next slide, please.
Say, Laura.
Yeah.
Say, I hate to do this because we should really have more time to talk through some of this stuff. I'm just going to give it move to the unplugged part where we can talk more in detail about some of this stuff. Okay.
Perfect. Then I'm just going to quickly just go through these slides to show what some of the
Perfect.
information is. Okay.
Thanks.
Move on. So these are some of the resources that I'm going to provide you guys we'll provide it in the chat, but we'll also provide it in that email, follow-up email. There's the dimensions of diversity wheel, inclusion resolution that I really love that you can give out to staff, and some other information. Please, next slide. Okay, so YMCA of the USA does have dedicated to diversity, inclusion, and global. They have a pipeline for suppliers and stuff that are seeking out talented minority and women-owned contractors so that otherwise can choose those over other service providers. There's so many whys that this is a really big deal, and that we can support those. They offer trainings for us. They offer all of these marketing materials. Like for Pride Month, they offered some marketing materials for us. Next slide, please. Our CEO of the YMCA of the USA also did a article in the Time, and this was the article there. Kevin Washington's his name. This is his last year, unfortunately, but he talks about the history of the Y and its history with slavery and racism. We do have a long history, but it's an important one in acknowledging that. So that's, next slide, please. They also provide us with a lot of data. So we can see, you'll be able to take this with you, but because Ys all over, all Ys are different, right? And we all serve our communities differently and have different services. Some have food programs, some don't, some do social services, some don't. And so all of this information is really useful in us to be able to help our communities. Okay, next slide, please. So, and if you didn't know, YMCA as a global movement, there are 119 countries that have YMCAs. It's all over. It's wonderful and it's awesome. One YMCA may look different. As I mentioned previously, some have social services. In other countries, a YMCA may not have a gym or a swim. It may just be social services. And so one perspective that we really need to start thinking of as our communities become more global, especially Minnesota, is if someone were to come from another country, what is their perspective when they come to the US and their why is completely different? They're expecting these certain services, thinking, oh, the YMCA can help me, in this community. I see one. And then it's not what their initial perception would be on what the why meant to them coming into the US. Next slide, please. There's a whole global movement. They try to incorporate otherwise to work with Ys in other countries, to provide services, to help fundraise and bring more services to countries. Please check out YMCA of the USA and their website and some of the stuff that they're doing across the globe. But just a big snapshot, so I apologize for the quickness about this, but next slide, please. And there's my contact information right at the bottom. I know we're going to chat soon, but I just wanted to.
Yeah, thanks, Laura.
Sorry,
we only
Chet.
have a couple minutes that we told people that we'd have here. So just going to take a minute to say, clearly there's a lot to learn here and there's a lot of work to be done. And again, I apologize to our employers. I know that y'all have a lot of great resources to offer. Hopefully people can stick around and talk to them here. But I just want to say we're coming to the end of our formal program here. We didn't have much time to talk about the inclusive workforce employer designation, but this is a recognition program that's popping up in different parts of the state. Contact your local workforce board if you like to get involved, or if they haven't started it there yet, maybe you can encourage them to do that. I can talk about that a little bit more in the after session as well. But Sean, why don't we forward to the last slide here? Just want to make sure you're aware. Oh, go back one here. Everybody's aware our next session will be on August 4th. We're going to continue this conversation, talk about recruiting, specifically recruiting and hiring a diverse workforce, and what that looks like. And we'll have some employer guests there as well. That's on August 4th. And I'm going to just pass it back to Jackie to say thank you.
Yes, I just want, on behalf of the Workforce Strategy Consultant team and on behalf of all of us, we want to thank you for spending time with us today. We really value our relationship with our employers and our workforce partners, and we know how valuable your time is. So we appreciate you joining us today. Please feel free to reach out to any of us on any of the strategies that were shared today, or if you have information you want to share on best practices that your organization is doing, please reach out to, again, any of the workforce strategy consultants or myself. As we said, resources will be sent out, a recording of this presentation will be sent out, and we also ask in that information in a follow-up email to fill out a survey, because we want to make sure that these are valuable meetings for you. You can sign up for email blasts and to automatically receive information about key topics, about these events and various blogs that our workforce strategy consultants are writing on careerforcemn.com. And this at 12 noon, which is 12:01, we are going to allow people that need to leave, and we're going to ask the rest of you to stay on for Workforce Wednesday Unplugged, which is a question and answer opportunity where you can unmute, you can turn your cameras on, and we can have more of a casual conversation with our presenters and workforce strategy consultants today. So we'll just take a couple-minute break, and everybody that wants to stay on, please stay on so then we can continue our conversation. Thank you so much.